I've been playing Spider-Man VR games for a long time, and I've seen a lot over the years. I've watched tech demos turn into full games. I've seen full games get sequels. But something I've seen less often is a Spider-Man VR game disappear, become unplayable. It hasn't happened often, but a piece of history was lost with each occasion. To keep them alive, these are the stories of the Spider-Man VR games you just can't play anymore. Movie tie-in games have been a thing for years, and with Spider-Man specifically, they're nothing new. Each of the Raimi movies got a game, as well as both TASM films, but with the MCU Spider-Man movies, things would be different. Spider-Man PS4 was the product of these changes, but on the VR front, old habits would die hard. Spider-Man Homecoming: The Virtual Reality Experience launched on June 30, 2017, and was free on both PC and PSVR. Experience was certainly the right word for it, because it wasn't a game. You'd shoot webs at bottles for about 5 minutes, have a little scuffle with the vulture, but when it finally appeared you were about to web swing for the first time in VR, it ended. Needless to say, it wasn't quite the Spider-Man experience people were expecting or looking for, and players of the game made that feeling vocal. Create VR, the team that Sony worked with to build the experience, would listen. Just under 2 years later, Spider-Man Far From Home VR was released and immediately lauded. For the first time, Spider-Man fans like myself could swing through the streets of Manhattan in VR. The gameplay loop of web-swinging traversal made it infinitely replayable, and in an era devoid of other Spider-Man VR games, infinitely fun. To that end, the city was quite large. There were alternate costumes to unlock, like combat missions and time trials. Tom Holland and Jacob Batalon even provided voice work. Though undoubtedly a watershed moment in Spider-Man VR game history, the game's positives end there. Far From Home VR's biggest issue came from its design. Being a free promotional game, it catered predominantly to new VR users. Although comfort options were toggleable, movement speed was completely throttled to prevent motion sickness. Web physics were also altered to serve this goal. Instead of swinging in pendular arcs, you'd be pulled towards the contact point of your web, more like a grapple than a web line. It filled a void no other game would until several years later, but in 2022, after several games with spider-like mechanics debuted, players began to notice both Homecoming and Far From Home VR were no longer available to download. It's been theorized that the publishing license expired, but the reason they might have chosen not to renew it is compelling. See, if we check the SteamDB pages for both games, Homecoming VR peaked at 36 players the day it was released, and after that, it struggled to reach even 10. You could attribute that to lower VR adoption at the time, but Far From Home VR didn't fare much better. It peaked at 251 a few days after its release and barely hit the high teens in the years following. But something else you'll notice is a spike in player counts for both games in December 2021, the month of Spider-Man No Way Home's premiere. The Spider-Man VR community is small, but we're devoted, and many of us expected a No Way Home VR experience would drop alongside the movie. But of course, that never happened, and now, even unplayable, Far From Home VR is the closest we've ever gotten to an official Spider-Man VR game. But some games are so good that its fans won't let it die. This was the case with Marvel Powers United. A licensed, shockingly high-quality exclusive to the Oculus Rift CV1, MPU boasted a roster of 18 playable characters, including Spider-Man. It was one of the most expensive VR games to date and had a then unheard of 2-year development cycle. Unlike Far From Home VR, the game was visually stunning and full of content. Critics though unanimously agreed that the gameplay was a little bit repetitive. It centered around a 4-person co-op horde mode, which saw players defeat enemies, defend and attack objectives, and face off against bosses like Venom and Magneto. This meant there was little web swinging for Spider-Man. Instead, the most exciting movement you could do was web zipping between perch points, a far cry from the free roaming experience Far From Home VR provided only a year later. But where that game excelled in movement, MPU did in combat. Webs could be used creatively to pull enemies towards you, into each other, or to redirect explosives. You also had taser webs and spider drones at your disposal, among other powers. Even with lukewarm critical reception, players fell in love with the game. However, their devotion wouldn't be enough to save it. Not unlike its sister, MPU would suddenly disappear from digital storefronts one day in 2021. But even worse, Meta was completely bricking the game. MPU was a multiplayer game, but it could be played alone, with bots filling the empty spaces. But even with that functionality, the game was being shut down. Low player numbers and expiring licenses have been cited as reasons for the shutdown, but with a community-led revival project happening in 2024, that might not have been true. A Discord server of MPU fans successfully relaunched the single-player portion of the game in August. The reintroduction of multiplayer was also planned, but Meta squashed the whole project not even a month later. Today, MPU isn't just a dead Spider-Man VR game. It's an example of how quickly digital goods can be taken away, and the VR community won't forget Meta's haste in doing so. The downfall of these three games can be chalked up to some legal or corporate drama. But what about indie Spider-Man VR games? The kind made by small teams or even lone developers? The Unbreakable Gumball is one of them, a Spider-Man VR game I once called the best in the genre. A year afterwards though, I came to find the game was unplayable. It happened that the game was designed for Rift, Vive, and Quest 1 headsets. By the time I replayed it, I'd upgraded to Quest 2, as had millions of others. This meant Gumball was incompatible with the most popular headset at the time. In the present day, however, I've discovered Gumball has been updated. The game now works on Quest 2 and plays beautifully. You'll need to download the game from itch.io, as the Steam demo is still unplayable. Also, it seems the developer has been discussing a possible Quest 3 port of the game, but these comments are over 6 months old. It's great that Gumball is back, but I'd hate to see it become unplayable again. Every Spider-Man VR game is a piece of the genre's history, and we should all work together to keep that history alive.